Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Laura Smestad. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in Seattle, Washington. I'm part of a group practice called Polaris Family Behavioral Health, and I specialize in the treatment of OCD and OCD-related disorders, children all the way through adults. And I'm also the creator of a series of game-based OCD exposure workbooks, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about later when we take a break from questions. I'm really excited to share this. I've been on a few times before, so some of you may have already heard me talk about this, but I have a few new things out there that I'm excited to share. And I'm so excited to answer your questions. I see we already have a few rolling in. So please continue to put your questions in the chat as we go along, and I'm going to try to answer as many of them as I possibly can. Okay, so we're going to start with this one. How to handle OCD that manifests as your values are changing or not true. My normal strategy of embracing uncertainty and following preset values is out of the window when I get this thought. So this is another trick that OCD likes to play on us, right? Especially if you've done a really good job of embracing uncertainty in other areas. It might try to hit you in a place that hits a little bit closer to home, like your values and who you are as a person, because OCD likes to attack things that you care about, which is just really rude, right? There are a few things that you can do with this. You can try to do some intentional intrusive thought exposures. So instead of just the uncertainty of maybe my values are changing and maybe they're not, which it sounds like that hasn't been as helpful for you, picking one thought, picking maybe my values have changed in this way, or my values are changing, and really stick with that thought. Take note of what level your anxiety is at. If you use a 1 to 10 SUD scale, you can gauge it that way. And then continue to repeat the thought to yourself, either out loud in your head or writing it down until you notice that anxiety level decrease. Usually we're looking for at least 50%, but if you can do it until it goes all the way down or even until you're bored with the thought, that can be a really great way to work up towards embracing uncertainty. And then the other side that I would encourage you to look at is, are you engaging in any rituals associated with this? So are you doing any internal checking? Are you comparing yourself to other people or Googling, what does a person with these specific values do or believe? And trying to, obviously, the goal would be to just stop doing those rituals. But if that is too much of an exposure for you, you can try to delay or change those rituals in some way. But focusing on the exposure side and the response prevention side might get you to a place where you can really be in that uncertainty and tolerate the anxiety and tolerate the uncertainty and distress in a way that it sounds like it's a little too hard for you to do with this specific content area. Thank you for your question. Okay. Sorry, sometimes it takes me a little while to get the groove of reading the questions and answering them. This is more of a statement, but I really want to speak to this. I try to disregard a thought when I do. My anxiety is extreme and I just can't. I really love that this was put in the chat because I think it's kind of a misconception that we should just be completely like distracting or disregarding a thought and not giving it any time of day, because in a lot of ways that can actually be what we call experiential avoidance, where it's, oh, well, I don't want this thought, and so I'm just going to push it away and it's not going to be there, instead of actually sitting in the anxiety and dealing with it. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where we might kind of go down the rabbit hole and ruminate and think about it too much. And so the best thing is to kind of find this sweet spot in the middle where you are in this discomfort, you are tolerating it, not enjoying it. You're able to be there, trying to, again, similarly to what I shared with the last question, is if you can focus in on a thought without letting it spiral and do an exposure that way. The more that you avoid and push things away, it's just avoidance. And that's different from saying, okay, I'm having this intrusive thought. this could potentially distress me or cause me anxiety if I focus on it. So I'm just going to like live my life. That's a very healthy thing, very different. But the idea of, oh, I'm having this thought, I need to push it away and I need to not like think about it, could actually be the reason why a lot of people aren't making progress, because they're not allowing themselves to tolerate that anxiety. Um, and obviously, each thought is going to be different. Those of you who are working with an ERP therapist, you've most likely created a fear hierarchy where you've rated all of your exposures and all the response prevention from, based on the level of difficulty or anxiety producing it would be. Um, and we typically, most people don't start with a 10 because that feels really, really terrible. And for some people can even be a little traumatizing. Personally, when I'm working with clients, we usually start in the 3-4 range, things that sometimes aren't as distressing, sometimes are, and work in those places where they can find success. So this practice of staying with a thought or staying within the anxiety may be more difficult for the more difficult thoughts. And the more that you work through ERP, especially like around that general thought, and the more you practice staying aware of, are you ruminating? Are you avoiding? Can you be in that feeling for at least an amount of time? It will start to get easier. And again, this is all dependent on, the severity of your OCD and a number of other factors. They could be the ones that, even if you're sitting in the anxiety and it's unbearable, might be too difficult to start on. And so I would really recommend finding a therapist who specializes in OCD and exposure and response prevention for OCD, if you aren't already. And then you guys can work on constructing a fear hierarchy to be able to get at some of those things so that the thoughts aren't as distressing. Because we all have intrusive thoughts. I think this weekend, someone I know was talking about, there was a study done that said, I think 80 to 90% of people reported having intrusive thoughts, and then the joke afterwards was, and the other 10% are lying, because everybody has these thoughts. And for someone with OCD, simply having the thought can be really distressing. And so getting to a place where you probably will still have the thoughts, because we all have intrusive thoughts, but where they don't cause that much extreme anxiety. And even if they cause a little anxiety, you're able to tolerate and move forward. Okay, let me look through some of these questions. Okay, here's the next one. Why is it the more I live with my harm OCD, the more it feels like my reality and that I'm actually this horrible person? How to keep hope of being your old self back? My guess is the reason this starts to feel more like your reality is because your OCD definitely wants you to feel like this is real. It makes you want to feel like this is your life. Um, and these are all very true things, even if you know logically and have the insight that, okay, this isn't actually real, this isn't actually how I feel. OCD is going to work really hard to make you feel like it is. And so, the more that you give into that and give into OCD, either by ritualizing, which includes avoiding things, the OCD can get stronger and stronger and start to fight back even more and try to solidify this fear even more. On the flip side, I've also had people, usually toward the beginning of ERP treatment, where they start to make some headway and make some progress, and then they start to feel like, not worse, but almost like OCD has like punched back, like they have attacked OCD and then OCD is coming right back for them. So sometimes that can account, if you are doing ERP and engaging in it, can account for some of those feelings too, of like, oh, it feels even more like my reality because OCD feels you pushing back and it's going to push back even more. And finding hope, especially while having OCD, can be difficult. um, Engaging in treatment is, I find, really helpful for a lot of people because they're able to, take action and see their progress. And so even if they don't have a lot of hope or motivation at the very beginning, once they start to see that movement and see even just a little bit of evidence that life doesn't have to be this way forever, that usually will give a little bit of hope as well. And then the more that you work through treatment and do ERP, um, the OCD thoughts are going to feel less real for most people. That's what we know, that ERP works for most people. So right now it feels real. It feels like you're a horrible person because that's exactly what OCD wants you to think. And the more that you push back and fight against it, the less it's going to feel like that over time. Thank you for sharing that and asking that question. Okay. Okay. I'm currently dealing with ROCD, so relationship OCD, and it's focused on partner's annoyance, her voice, things she says, etc. How do I react to the fear and make room for these feelings? Um, so I'm a little unsure if it's you being annoyed by your partner or your partner being annoyed by you. So I'll just kind of speak to both of those things. I know it's pretty common for a lot of people who have OCD that's focused more on relationship stuff to feel like they can't have any negative feelings toward their partner. um, and so I'll speak to that aspect of it first of like if you are annoyed by your partner, but also feel like you can't feel those things for fear that it will mess up the relationship or you won't be the right partner for them and things like that. Trying to not avoid and push away is probably going to be one of the best ways to react to this because the fear is there, the thought is there, and allowing yourself to really feel and be in the feelings, which I know like it sounds simple when I say it, but can be difficult for a lot of people. So I love this idea, even in the second part of the question of how do I make room for these feelings? Because that's a very real thing. We want to be able to have space to actually feel what's going on. Because again, if we avoid, that's not usually helpful. Um, and so even just something as simple as acknowledging this is what's going on. This is my OCD. This is uncomfortable. This feels bad. This feels scary. And I'm going to let these feelings exist and be in them. And eventually, over time, the more that you do that, I think the easier things tend to get, right? Just really allowing yourself to be there and acknowledge, like, I know what this is, um, gaining that awareness. It sounds like you have a lot of awareness around your OCD. And so being aware, this is my OCD. You could even feel like, okay, OCD, yeah, I see you. Um, and it's uncomfortable to be here in these feelings that I don't like or that my OCD tells me I shouldn't have. And really focusing on being in them. And if at first it's difficult to just indefinitely be in them or to be in them until you wait for your anxiety to go down, you can build up to that, right? Like, okay, for the next few minutes, I'm going to really focus in on what I'm feeling and try to tolerate that, even though it's uncomfortable. Um, and then the other side, if your question was actually referring to like fear that you're annoying your partner, which is another very common OCD theme related to relationships. Um, if you're in ERP treatment, there are lots of fun exposures to do around that. And starting out, sometimes I'll have people actually bring their partner into our sessions and we go through this where they're purposefully annoying them. And then also looking at what compulsions go along with that. Do you not speak? Do you avoid speaking your mind or overanalyze what you're going to say before you say it because you're afraid that you're going to bother somebody? And that, goes beyond romantic relationships as well with a lot of scrupulosity type thoughts. And so you'll find a lot of my answers tonight revolve around ultimately doing ERP, especially with questions specifically related to getting rid of OCD stuff. But going back to that, right? Doing the exposures, creating those safety cues for your brain, and then doing the response prevention side so that you're not giving into OCD will apply to most things. So I apologize in advance. I'll probably repeat myself on that a decent amount. So yeah, I would say really exactly what you said. How do I make room for these feelings? Try to make room for those feelings and acknowledge that they're there and why they're there, and that you are in a place where you are learning to tolerate and deal with anxiety, discomfort, and uncertainty. Thank you so much for that question. Okay, let me read through some of these. Okay, I'm so glad we have so many questions. I wish I could get to every single one of them. Um, okay, this is one I think a lot of people will be able to relate to, especially if OCD has gotten really bad and really severe. I obsess all day, sometimes that I'm depressed. How do you handle this? So, what's interesting is that people obviously can have OCD and have depression, and a lot of times depression is a byproduct of OCD. And so it sounds like in your case, the amount of obsessing that you're doing is actually causing a lot of depression symptoms. And so first, I would really recommend, if it's accessible to you, to find a therapist who really knows OCD, and someone who is well versed in depression, so that you can work on the OCD primarily, since the depression is probably a symptom of that, and be able to work through a little bit of the depression. And then if you notice that the depression piece is actually more severe than the OCD, then the focus may end up switching there. But having someone who can really help you with that, I think would be the first line of defense. Obviously, this webinar is through NoCD. NoCD is a great resource, and has a lot of really wonderful therapists who all really know about OCD. So that would be my first recommendation. And then I find that ruminating and obsessing, which is considered a mental ritual, is probably one of the hardest rituals to stop, or even realize is happening at some point. Like if it's a physical compulsion, sometimes people can be more aware, like, oh, I've gone and I've done this thing, or I'm walking over to this side of the room to do this specific behavior, and maybe have more awareness. But because we all think all the time, there are lots of thoughts going on in our head. Sometimes it can be hard to catch it when we're obsessing and when we're ruminating. And so that can also be really difficult to stop. If it was as easy as, oh, well, just stop obsessing, then none of you would be here and I wouldn't have a job. So it's not quite as simple as just stop. And again, trying to find that space where you're not excessively ruminating, trying to figure things out, going down the rabbit hole. But you're not just like putting a band-aid over it and going, okay, well, I can't stop obsessing, so I'm going to go watch Netflix. Finding a place where, and again, it might start with isolating one thought or one aspect of it and being able to focus on it, and then doing the exposure and response prevention that goes along with the things that you're obsessing about, and gradually reducing. And a trained therapist who knows OCD and ERP can help you tailor, all of that to you and what's specifically going on for you. OCD is, it just manifests in so many different ways. And even being an ERP therapist for years now, I'm still like, I know I haven't seen everything. I still will have intakes where I'm like, oh, I've never seen that specific presentation of OCD before, because OCD can latch on to almost anything. I wouldn't be surprised. And so finding someone who can really tailor treatment to you and what's going on for you, I think would also be a great step. So thank you. Okay, and if I am skipping questions, it might be because my answer again is do ERP. um, so I'm just throwing that out there. So a lot of these specific things of how do I handle this specific OCD fear, ERP, finding a therapist if you can, if there's one accessible. Thankfully, telehealth makes that more accessible for a lot of people who might not have therapists immediately in their area, which again is why NoCD is a really great resource. Um, okay. Is it normal for OCD to feel somewhat constant but with random intense spikes? Like the spikes are intense crying sessions every couple of months, then going back to normal, constant OCD thoughts. The risk of possibly giving reassurance, which I don't ever want to do, I'm going to say that yes, I have seen this many, many times. So I won't go ahead and say normal because that's very relative, but I know that a lot of people will have spikes like this. And, that could be for a number of reasons. I know that for people who menstruate around certain parts of their cycle, they feel more intense OCD symptoms, just because hormones, right? Also, oftentimes, if people are not sleeping, not eating well, not taking care of kind of those basic needs. OCD probably feels a little more intense. People who are on meds who aren't consistent with meds can also see spikes in OCD. So that's really important if you're on medication to be consistent with it. Um, so yeah, very, very possible. I've learned again that like almost everything is possible with OCD. I don't think that there will ever be a point in my career where I feel like I've actually seen it all and heard it all, and now I can hang my hat and leave. Like, which is one of the reasons I love what I do because OCD is so interesting. Um, and yes, that definitely happens with spikes and things like that. So you're not alone. Okay. I'm going to take just like a few more and then we'll take a little break from questions. I'll share a little bit about my workbooks and then we can dive back in again. Um, okay, this is a great one. I'm scared that if I agree with a thought, it will become true. Um, this is the basis for so many people's OCD presentation. So going back to that, we all have intrusive thoughts. Like almost everyone, I think, has had some thought similar to like, oh, I wonder what would happen if I drove off this bridge. Like I've had thoughts like that. And the person without OCD can just be like, well, that was weird. Okay. And then just kind of move along with their day and maybe never even think about it again. Someone with OCD, especially if their OCD latches onto that thought, might continue on with that. And instead of just being like, oh, this is a thought, it's, well, why did I have this thought? If I have this thought, there's meaning behind it and there's a reason behind it. You know, if I had that thought, does that mean that I want to drive off a bridge? Does that mean that I want to hurt myself? Does that mean that I am homicidal or suicidal? And it could keep spiraling and spiraling. This is especially prevalent with some of the more taboo OCD themes, where one of the reasons why the thought is so distressing is because it doesn't actually align with how the person feels, but their OCD tells them if you have this thought, it's because you want to do it. If you have this thought, it's real. And something that I've heard quite a bit from clients of mine who may have been in previous therapy with really well-meaning therapists who, just no one knew this person had OCD and didn't know that this may have been unhelpful, is this idea of like we create our own destiny. Like if you think positive things, then your life will be positive. If you think negative things, your life will be negative. For someone with OCD, that can be pretty triggering because their fear is already, oh, I had this thought. That means it's going to happen and going to come true. So this idea of like, we manifest our destiny through our thoughts can be pretty distressing for someone with OCD because that is one of the biggest sources of fear. And so I'm not going to give reassurance and say that it won't become true because maybe it will and maybe it won't. And again, when you're doing ERP, things are going to really be tailored to you with exposure and response prevention, making sure that you're doing things, in an order that's going to be helpful for your treatment and at levels that are going to be helpful for your treatment, so that eventually maybe you're working up to a place where you can agree with the thought. Like with the example that I gave of what if I drove off a bridge? Maybe right now, if I'm starting therapy, it's too hard to say, as an exposure, I do want to drive off a bridge. That might be too hard. I might not be there yet, but there's so many things that I can do in the interim on the exposure side and the response prevention side to eventually work up to that. Also, if like saying thoughts out loud is too hard, sometimes writing them isn't as difficult for people. Or even, if you're working with a therapist, if they know the thought, then they can say it to you, whisper it to each other. There are lots of ways to work up towards, like, as an exposure, agreeing with the thought. So thank you for that. Oh, and I just realized you had a second part of your statement, which was, or give it a maybe statement. So agreeing or embracing that uncertainty of maybe it's true, maybe it's not, seems like both of those are really scary and really hard. And so you can work your way up to that. A therapist can help you construct a fear hierarchy where you can work up to being able to do that. And my guess is that these thoughts that you're having might be incongruent with how you actually feel, which tends to make it even harder for people to agree with something, because they're afraid that it's going to become reality and become true. Okay, so we'll take a little tiny break from questions, talk about my workbooks a little bit. When Jenna asked me if I would come on again to do this, we were like, oh, and it's close to Christmas, so you can keep that in mind, Christmas gifts for yourself or someone else. And I will share where you can get these workbooks towards the end. So I've been working on a series of game-based, I like to say activity books because people tend to not like workbooks, but these are not like traditional workbooks. They're not boring. And the way this came about is I was creating all of these games and activities for my clients, and they seem to go over really well. I find that when we can make exposures fun, people are more willing to do it. And it doesn't really take away the effectiveness of the exposure. But it does increase motivation for a lot of people. And so these workbooks are advertised for teens, but it's really for anybody who wants some new creative strategies. Maybe you need an increase in motivation. And so the workbooks that are available, I have a perfectionism one, which I'll show you a little bit from, scrupulosity themed one. I've worked with Dr. Wendy Ashcraft on 2 contamination themed books, a bathroom contamination and a COVID contamination. And then I have one for airplane fears. And then my most recent one that I released just a few months ago is a harm themed book. A few times ago when I was on here, it seemed like a lot of people were interested in that. And so, again, all of these are game-based things. And so I'll show you just kind of a few examples of what that might look like. This is the perfectionism book. And, there are things like color by numbers, but do it wrong. And then there are examples of ways you can do it wrong. There are some drawing exposures. We have some like bingo things. So if someone has perfectionism around their bedroom, they can complete this bingo card, maybe have a goal for themselves once they do all of those exposures. It's also just like a fun idea in general for people who are doing ERP and they have a bunch of exposures that they're planning on doing, but like there's no way to make them fun or make them a game. You could like make a bingo card with all of your exposures, and then when you get blackout on your bingo, you have a reward of some type. Imperfect crossword puzzles, which people love to hate because there aren't enough spaces for the letters for all of them. So it's a lot of things like that. And the Scrupulosity book, which I had a lot of fun with, has a lot of like word searches with potentially triggering words. Most of the books have word searches and word jumbles, because sometimes the words alone can be hard. In the Scrupulosity book, looking up urban dictionary items that are inappropriate and potentially drawing out pictures to represent them. There's some connect the dots, there's some exposure script prompts. There's some like Mad Libs for Bible verses, which is really great for people with more religious themes, scrupulosity, roll the dice insults, lots of fun stuff. And again, I really decided to publish these because people were really engaging with them and telling me that they were great motivators to do exposures. So I am going to put the website where you can find these workbooks in the chat. It will let me. Okay, so that is in the chat in just a second. And if anyone's interested, you can go look through it. They're all on Amazon. And yeah, so I think that's all I have to say about that. But I really love sharing, low cost resources for OCD. And especially for people who maybe need a little extra motivation in their ERP work. It's also great for any therapists watching to just kind of have on hand in the office. It's a great adjunct to therapy. That's really what it was designed for. So if you've never done ERP before, I would recommend first like being in ERP treatment so you know how to handle the exposures and what to do with them and how to decide like what might be too hard and could be traumatic, or what just kind of where to start in that whole process. So, okay. So we still have about 15 more minutes, so I will answer a few more questions. There's so many questions, which I really, really appreciate. Okay, let me take a moment and see what we have. Okay. Does anyone else have a normal positive thought that is immediately followed by negative intrusive thought after dealing with harm OCD or fear of losing control? I know for a fact this is very common because I actually had two people today talk about this in session, so this is relevant for me. And that kind of goes back to the way I conceptualize OCD is like this bully that just wants to make your life miserable. So you'll be really happy about something, and then OCD is like, nope, we're not having that. And so then it's going to give you something that causes you distress, usually, um, which is no fun. And so this, quite frankly, sucks. And I'm really sorry that, this is something that you have to deal with. Um, the more that you fight OCD, the less this starts to happen. But again, like I said earlier on, sometimes when people first start to fight back and do ERP and they make a little headway, OCD might try to fight back. So, but eventually over time, if you really work in treatment, that will happen less. And not necessarily that you'll have the thoughts less. Most people have less intrusive thoughts. Um, but because we all have intrusive thoughts, you might have a really positive thought, and then you might have a negative intrusive thought, but then that negative intrusive thought isn't going to impact you in the same way, that it won't be distressing. It'll just be a thought. That was a bad thought. Let me go back to the positive one because that's the one that I actually care about, and I don't actually care about that negative thought. So again, another thing that you're not alone. And that's why I really love these webinars, is that people can see that, okay, I am not alone in my struggle, especially with OCD because it's so misrepresented in the media. What we see on movies and TV shows about OCD is very narrow and maybe exaggerating like a small percentage of what OCD actually looks like, and it misses a lot of it. So I know a lot of people with OCD feel like, oh, I must be the only person who's had these thoughts, or I must be the only person who feels this way, because it's not presented in pop culture. It's not talked about. OCD is extremely misdiagnosed, so even professionals don't catch it. And so someone might be having these thoughts and not even realize that they're related to OCD, which can also make them feel alone. And then, especially when you get to more of the taboo thoughts, that's where I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, this must just be me. I'm a terrible person who's had these thoughts. No one else has ever had these thoughts before. And oftentimes that's not true. So I appreciate all of these questions, and hopefully we're cultivating more of a sense of universality, that people aren't alone in their struggles. Okay. Okay, let me answer this. Does anyone else struggle with hearing the news of a school shooting or other crazy event and can't quit trying to think of how that person got that way, and how do I not end up like that? For questions around like, does anyone else struggle with this, or is it possible to have OCD around this? I'm just gonna be like, yeah, probably, because it's possible to have OCD around everything, and very possible that a lot of other people are struggling with this as well, especially in light of some recent events. I know a lot of people I work with are struggling with some OCD around school shootings, um, which is hard because, they're real events that didn't happen where they were, but have happened in other places. And, I guess similarly to the pandemic, with people who have contamination fears, and then there's a real threat when you have OCD fears, and there's a real threat, that can also be hard to navigate. And then it sounds like there is kind of a scrupulosity layer to this of like, I like fear of being a bad person, and I don't want to end up harming other people. In the way that I've seen this happen in other places, which goes in line with a lot of harm related OCD and morality stuff within OCD. Yeah, and so hearing news of that can be triggering, and then OCD is just gonna like latch onto that. So again, a real event that probably bothers a lot of people, and maybe a lot of people have the thought even of, oh, I hope that I don't end up like that person. And then OCD might scoop that thought up and be like, that's a thought that I want to mess with, and then make you obsess and ruminate and probably ritualize, so that you don't become that person. And so it sounds like there's a decent amount of rumination that's going on, which I think we don't talk enough about how rumination is a mental compulsion. Same thing with like obsessively trying to figure things out, which could be a piece of this too, it sounds like, of how do I not end up that way? And then you're just kind of running in circles because no answer is ever really going to be enough for OCD. And so, again, maybe I'm a broken record, but examining what rituals am I engaging in? Is there anything excessive that I'm doing, anything ritualistic that I'm doing to maybe prevent myself from becoming that person? Other than rumination, that's one as well, but any other types of compulsions that you're engaging in, and try to eventually eliminate those. If you can just eliminate them cold turkey, great, that's the ideal. If you can't, delay, change them, um, partially ritualize at first to get to a place where you don't anymore. Something that is good for a lot of people who are working on specific compulsions is to create what a lot of therapists call a ban book, where let's say my ritual for this is searching up qualities of people who end up becoming school shooters, and then maybe I'm comparing myself to that list and checking to make sure that I'm not like that. I can create a little band book, which you could actually be a book or it could be a notepad on your phone or just on your computer or something, where I have two columns. I have the amount of times I gave in and the amount of times I resisted. And then every time I search for that and give in, I put a tally mark on the give in side. And every time I have the urge and I don't do it, I put a tally on the resist. You could also add like a delay if that's like where you are and that's what you're working on. And I find that that's also a really good just visual for a lot of people, because, and just a self-awareness piece, because some people don't have a strong grasp of how much they're ritualizing, um, and how often they're actually giving into their compulsions. Like they probably have an idea of like, oh, I know it's probably a lot, but then when they actually count, it's like, oh, this is a lot. And so that can be helpful. And then just to see the visual, and like some people will do a new column every day, every week, but then you can see it start to change where the resist side tally marks becomes longer than the give in side, which also I think gives people hope and motivation. That was a little bit of a tangent, but maybe is applicable here. And then there is the exposure side of this as well, which can be a little tricky, again, with a sensitive subject and something that is going on in the world. So that's where I feel like it'd be really great to work, again, with an ERP therapist who can really build that with you, especially for things that might feel even scarier because there's evidence to back up that it could happen. Not to say that the completely illogical OCD stuff doesn't feel just as bad, because it definitely feels really bad. But when it's supported by evidence, again, similar to the pandemic, and just might have an extra layer onto it. So having that support can be really important. Okay, is having dementia a theme as OCD? Um, so kind of circling back to something I said before, like, is it possible to have OCD around blank? Yes, OCD you can grasp onto anything. I know there are a lot of people who have OCD around fear of getting either specific illnesses, mental illnesses, forgetting things. This seems to fall into some of those categories. And then it's just specifically like, this is the one that's targeting. So yes, absolutely, that can be a theme. That can be something that your OCD latches onto. And just like any other theme, you treat it the same way. ERP, can you tell I love ERP? Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. And that's because, I mean, I see that it works all the time. Um, this is what I do. 100% of my clients have OCD. We're doing ERP, and I see people making progress, which just makes me so excited that there is a treatment modality that works for the large majority of people, and is really effective and really evidence based. And so I probably sound like I've been paid by like an ERP organization to just like push it, but really I just love it so much because I see that it works. Okay. Let me find another question. We have about 5 minutes. We have time for a few more. Okay, I love this. This is such great questions. I love all of these questions. Can learning about OCD become a form of compulsion and reassurance? Yes. So this is a place where there's some balance and juggling involved, because being educated on OCD is really important for treatment. Because at least my style as an ERP therapist is I'm essentially training my clients to become their own therapists and eventually not need me anymore. So, I do need to teach them about OCD, about things to look out for, about reassurance seeking, about kind of sneaky compulsions that people don't view as compulsions necessarily because it's not intuitive, about fear hierarchies, about exposure treatment, about anxiety levels. It goes on and on. So there's a lot of teaching that has to happen. And so if you are working with a therapist who can help guide you through some of that psychoeducation piece, then that might be like a road to minimize any of this as a form of reassurance seeking, because you're not necessarily seeking out the information. You have someone else who's guiding you in a way that's appropriate for your treatment. So it is a balance between like staying educated and making sure you're not seeking reassurance or engaging in other compulsions. So one thing that I would look at is, do you actively want to learn more about OCD? And that's something that's like bringing you happiness. Is it something that you feel like you have to do? I have to know this. I need to know this information. If it's a need versus a want, probably more of a compulsion. After you look, do you feel a temporary relief? Maybe more of a compulsion. Compulsions satisfy OCD for like a little amount of time, not forever. And so if your anxiety is high, you ritualize, you get that relief, and then of course it comes back usually stronger. So I would look at that, and then also just thinking about, and this could be an experiment you do, if you have the thought of like, oh, I want to look up more stuff about OCD and learn more about OCD. If you were prevented from doing that in that moment, how would you feel? If you would be like, oh, it's totally fine, whatever, like I kind of wanted to, but like, whatever, I'm going to go make mac and cheese. Probably not a compulsion, but if you would feel discomfort, distress, anxiety, somatic symptoms, as a result, and maybe that even increases initially if you're prevented from doing that, that's also a sign that it could be a compulsion or reassurance seeking. And then also just thinking about the why, again, like the want versus need, but also like the why. Like, is there a lot of information about OCD that I don't know because I've never been educated on OCD before and I just found out that I have it? That might be a little different from someone who actually knows a decent amount about OCD and they just feel like they have to keep learning more, or even double check that they know what they know, or I need to dive into all of these different like OCD themes that could present. And also looking at the frequency, duration, is it excessive? Is it done in a specific way? Are you just like reading about OCD because you follow OCD Instagram accounts and like that's cool? Or are you spending like hours reading about OCD? So yes, and then a very long answer of how you can decipher that. Okay, I'm going to take one more question. I'm going to try to find one that doesn't have an answer that I've already said in some variation or some flavor. Okay, this will be our last question. How does someone surrender to harmful, intrusive thoughts when the last thing you want to do is harm anyone? I know that the idea of like surrendering to thoughts, especially when your thoughts revolve around potentially harming somebody, the idea of that alone can be really scary, because you've already acknowledged the last thing you actually want to do. The more that you're able to be in those thoughts, to tolerate the anxiety, to tolerate the uncertainty of like, maybe one day I'll snap and hurt someone, maybe one day I won't. I can't know anything for sure. Eventually, as you're engaging in ERP around this and being able to really be with the thoughts, that might, I feel like surrendering to the thoughts for some people could have the implication of like, oh yeah, what I want to do is hurt people. Sweet. Now let me go do that. And that's not what we mean by that. It means like really being present with the thoughts, being able to tolerate the thoughts, eventually getting to a point where they're just thoughts and you don't have a visceral emotional reaction from them. Um, and especially since you have the insight to know, well, this is an ego dystonic thing. This differs from how I actually feel and what I want to do. The more you engage in ERP, you're going to have safety cues that are sent to your brain that again show that, like, I guess, reinforce that you don't want to do this. You're just having thoughts, and these thoughts don't have to have the same power that they have right now for you, and they don't have to be so distressing and anxiety provoking. So hopefully that answers your question. There are so many questions, and I feel bad that we couldn't get to all of them. But thank you all for joining. Thank you for listening to me talk about my workbooks. I think I put in the chat the website, but I'll also verbally say it is exposurehub.org/workbooks. You can also on Amazon, I think if you search my name, Laura Smestad, LMHC, most of them come up, but Amazon's been a little iffy on that. And yeah, I really appreciate you guys asking questions and sharing your thoughts and feelings with me. I hope it was helpful for you all. And I'm just so happy to be here, and hopefully I'll be back soon. So I hope everyone has a great holiday season if you celebrate holidays, and I will hopefully see you soon.